Frontline 517, Apartheid Part 2. 57 minutes, 46 seconds, WGBH TV, Boston.
Funding for this special Frontline series is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Tonight on Frontline, turmoil in South Africa. An unprecedented five-part series explores over 300 years of segregation, repression, and white domination that has brought South Africa to the brink.
I've been lenient and patient. Don't push us too far.
Tonight, the white Afrikaner government unleashes the first crushing blows of apartheid. Stringent pass laws, inferior black education, and forced relocation.
We don't want to shoot the black man. We would rather govern him.
But black anger grows, and the resistance movement led by Nelson Mandela turns from nonviolence to militancy after 69 blacks are killed at Sharpeville. All on part 2 of Apartheid.
From the network of public television stations, a presentation of KCTS Seattle, WNET New York, WPBT Miami, WTVS Detroit, and WGBH Boston. This is a special Frontline series with Judy Woodruff.
Ladies and gentlemen, I come here this evening because of my deep interest and affection for a land settled by the Dutch in the mid-17th century, then taken over by the British and at last independent. A land in which the native inhabitants were at first subdued, but relations with whom remain a problem to this day. A land which defined itself on a hostile frontier. A land which was once the importer of slaves and now must struggle to wipe out the last traces of that form of bondage. I refer, of course, to the United States of America.
Good evening. I'm Judy Woodruff. It has been more than 20 years since Robert Kennedy drew those parallels between American and South African history in his speech to students at the University of Cape Town. But still today, the images of apartheid seem strikingly familiar to us, reminders of our own civil rights struggle. It is tempting to think of South Africa in terms of our own experience, for Selma to become Soweto, Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, Governor George Wallace, President P.W. Botha. But South Africa has its own story. As we learned in part 1 of our 5-part Frontline series called Apartheid, there are some critical differences in the racial histories of South Africa and the United States. Most fundamentally, in South Africa, blacks are not a minority, but the vast majority, nearly 3/4 of the population. In South Africa, the now dominant white Afrikaners were themselves dominated culturally and politically for decades by the British. In 1948, as hopeful signs of change in civil rights began appearing on the American horizon, South Africa stepped backward, electing the Afrikaner Nationalist Party to run the country with a new idea called apartheid. It is here at the beginning of this new order that we continue our story of South Africa's racial struggle. This program was produced by Alan Siegel of Granada Television.
In 1948, Prime Minister Smuts was asked why he lost what would prove to be the most decisive election in South Africa's history.
Oh, it's the post-war desire for change, you know. People don't like the old faces and the old voices and the old smiles and the old speeches. They want to change.
What defeated Smuts was apartheid. The man who took his parliamentary seat from him was Wenzel du Plessis.
For me, apartheid is not that dirty word which people say, which people claim, and which people throw at us like bits of slush and mud. Apartheid is a fact of nature. There are not two people in this world who are the same.
When the Governor-General opened the new session of South Africa's Parliament in 1948, it was to install a National Party Prime Minister, Daniel Malan. He swept the English-speaking whites from power and appointed a cabinet of all Afrikaners, whites of Dutch descent. They were the underclass of white politics who had at last climbed on top.
We were feeling the horizon was lifting. Skies were clearing. There was promise in the air. And we were going to avail ourselves of that opportunity, which we did.
I remember the result of that election as if it were yesterday. Up to then, there had been world reaction against racism, against the atrocities of the Nazi era. And there had been promises, of a better future. But when the nationalists came to power in 1948 under the leadership of a fellow called Dr. Malan, blacks were appalled. They were very worried that what had been said at election time might in fact come to fruition.
Not one of the country's 9 million Africans took part in the election. 70% of the population, they had lived under white rule for 300 years. Africans, together with Indians and the coloreds, had long been the victims of racial segregation. Under apartheid, segregation was to dominate every law of the land.
If we don't do that, we'll have chaos. The black man, he would overrun you. And then what do? You shoot him. That was the thing we wanted to avoid. We don't want to shoot the black man. We would rather govern him.
The triumphant Afrikaners soon dedicated their national monument. It celebrated their victories over Africans. Also, their determination to escape from rule by the British. Many of them envied the wealth and power still in the hands of the English-speaking whites.
This position of inferiority, being the underdogs in their own country, that was the real cause for the high temperature of Afrikaner nationalism. And it was this high temperature of Afrikaner nationalism, supported by the Dutch Reformed Church, etc., that united the Afrikaners and bring about the National Party victory in 1948, and the National Party is still in power after 38 years.
The National Party had won the election on the promise to stem the flow of Africans drawn into the cities in search of work. Poor whites feared competition from cheap labor. Makeshift squatter camps had mushroomed around the white suburbs of the major towns.
One must remember that we are few and they are many. And white people were afraid that if blacks, coloreds, and Indians were given free access to all amenities and all residential areas, this would result in the swamping of white areas with a deterioration of standards.
Such fears lay behind the new government's race measures. In 1950, in a law reminiscent of Europe a generation earlier, all South Africans were classified according to the color of their skin. New laws banned marriage and even sex between whites and any other racial group.
It creates a hybrid race, a bastard race. I'm very sorry that we have 1.5 million colored people in this country. They are the product of sins created by black and white people alike in this country. They are a people to be pitied rather than feared, the colored people.
The 1 million coloreds lived mainly in the Cape. Many had intermarried with whites. They were the most affected by the new laws.
Something like the Mixed Marriages Act simply had the added symbolical and emotional significance that you were being labeled outcast, that in the most intimate relationships with other people, where personal choice in the past had played the main role, you were being treated as some object that could be shifted around, as in a zoo.
Then in 1951, the government took away the coloreds' right to vote, a legacy of British rule in the Cape. The vote had even been enjoyed by some blacks until it was removed in the 1930s. Now the coloreds, backed by some liberal whites, appealed to the Supreme Court in defense of their vote. The court found for them. So the government appointed new judges.
Their goal was simply to get rid of the coloreds. And if it meant that they had to pack the High Court, they had to pack the Senate, in other words, render all the parliamentary institutions nugatory. If it meant that they had to do that, then they were going to do that, So that on the one hand, they were going to keep on ruling with these institutions. On the other hand, they're going to make these institutions merely paper institutions that they could, use as they wished.
The harshest measures fell on the Africans. In the hunt for work in the cities, many had settled in mixed communities alongside white areas. In Sophiatown, a black suburb of Johannesburg, some actually owned their homes. A few were middle class, even affluent. Most were poor. And by 1953, thousands were subtenants or squatters living in overcrowded backyards. Here, Africans, coloreds, and Indians had created a distinct culture.
Sophiatown was the soul of our people. It represented resistance against apartheid. It represented success against all odds. It was a feeling of a great community that contradicted everything that the white man says about black people. You can't have different tribes staying together because they kill each other at the drop of a feather. But Sophiatown contradicted all those myths because you had all the tribes there living together.
It was very far from being a glamorous place. In fact, it was a major slum. Conditions there were bad. There was tremendous overcrowding. The quality of the housing was deplorable in the majority of cases. And you had this very high population living in a very congested area with no amenities whatsoever.
Tremendous overcrowding, of course, very bad housing conditions because of the population. But behind all this, the uniqueness of Sophiatown was that it was one of the only two freehold African townships in Johannesburg, one of the two places where Africans could own their own homes.
Under apartheid, there was no place in the town for African homeowners. In 1953, the government ordered the 60,000 residents of Sophiatown to move out. It introduced new housing laws requiring each race group to live in separate areas. The Africans furthest from city centers. Residents of Sophiatown protested.
Every political meeting, whether it was the Odeon Cinema or Freedom Square, as it was called, open-air meetings, we always were able to bring out a vast number of people. I remember one meeting in the Odeon Cinema, the only cinema in Sophiatown, quite a posh one too. This was packed to the doors, and Nelson Mandela and I were the chief speakers.
For Mandela and his organization, the African National Congress, the defense of Sophiatown became vital in their campaign of opposition to apartheid. Recently, thousands of ANC supporters had staged a nationwide campaign of defiance of apartheid's laws. The government replied with new penalties and put many campaign leaders on trial. In Sophiatown, the ANC needed a victory, but nonviolent protest was no match for the government.
I think that people recognized that they hadn't a hope. What could they do? I mean, they had nothing. They had nothing to fight with. They were ordinary working people who had to have a roof over their heads. There were families. There were children. There were old people. They had no organized resistance in the sense of guns and all that stuff.
In 1955, 2,000 armed police moved into Sophiatown to oversee forced removals.
I was carrying my baby. I was in the bedroom. There was confusion. And the black man said, Sisi, Sheshisa, sister, be quick. Sifigile, we have come. I said, oh, my valuable things. How are they getting on the lorry? My husband was so quiet that I thought he was going to drop dead. Then the other black men came in to carry the cupboards, the stove, the what. You know, it was black in my eyes. I was standing in the bedroom just quiet. I did not know whether I was coming or going. So we just moved down the steps and we stood outside there. Look at others taking out our things on the lorry and then others breaking. It was just breaking and taking away.
Sophiatown set the pattern for the policy of forced removals. Some were moved to a new estate in what was to become Soweto. Africans lost their right to own a home and became government tenants. Many were just dumped on open ground. On the rubble of Sophiatown, an all-white suburb was built. The government named it Triumph. The driving force behind the removals was the new Minister for Native Affairs, Hendrik Vervoerd. To the outside world, he presented apartheid benevolently.
If gradual separation develops and each gets his full opportunities in the group of his own people, then he can go forward with the knowledge that he can end anywhere. Whereas if you try and keep the people together, it will mean nothing else than a continual clash owing to continual competition.
Vervoerd did not distinguish only between white and black. It was white, non-white in his whole thinking. In other words, basically racism. Now, if you look at everything that he applied, for example, the fact that all lifts in public buildings in Africa were segregated. One lift for whites, one for non-whites. All the public counters in the post office, everything, segregated. All the entrances to public buildings, whites, non-whites. The benches in the public parks, marked, whites, non-whites. Taxis, whites, non-whites. A non-white taxi was not even allowed to convey the luggage of a white person.
I had a written instruction from him that under no circumstances was I to shake hands with the black man when he came to see me in my office, and that in correspondence I was not to use the term dear sir. We had to use the term Muna, which is an African word meaning man, literally, man or gentleman in a more euphemistic sense. So there was no familiarity, no booty business, as we say in Afrikaans.
Vervoerd insisted that Africans, natives to most whites, must now be called Bantu, he was determined to reimpose tribal divisions on them. He devised a new education system, Bantu education. It would replace the English liberal teaching of church mission schools.
Yes. The girl is washing. The girl is washing. What is this? It is a piece of soap. Altogether, what is it? It is a piece of soap.
Vervoerd delivered a stinging rebuke to black aspirations. There is no place for the Bantu above the level of certain forms of labor. What is the use of teaching the Bantu child mathematics?
He spelled it out so very clearly in his speech to the Synod about the black man's place in society, how Bantu education was intended not only to re-tribalize him, but to make him aware forever and ever of his inferior position in society, about the pastures, the green pastures where white graze. He must know he would never be allowed to graze in those areas, that education would prepare him for his inferior status in society. Translated into inferior facilities in terms of classrooms, teacher training, qualifications, the whole panoply of the system produced an inferiorly educated child.
I wrote a pamphlet at the time which I called Education for Servitude, and that was exactly what it was. And Vervoerd was totally consistent about this at every level. I mean, I could tell you many instances of my struggle with Vervoerd on this thing, but it was totally clear. He was logical, and he wanted it to be the instrument which would ensure for good the basic philosophy of apartheid.
The Anglican Church in Johannesburg refused to teach Bantu education in its schools. Father Huddleston's school closed down. As the new system was imposed throughout the country, thousands of children and many teachers boycotted classes in protest. The ANC raised money to set up some alternative schools, but all resistance collapsed when Vervoerd issued an ultimatum.
He gave a D-Day for the teachers, for the parents to get their children to school and the teacher to get to class. And said on a special date, if the teacher is not in class and the child is not in school, the child would never gain entrance in school again in the countries of Africa. And the teacher would never teach again under South Africa anymore. So parents said, well, half a loaf is better than nothing. Let the children go.
From now on, African children were split up by tribal language into separate primary schools. Vervoerd imposed the same ideas on new housing schemes for Africans. In Soweto, whole areas were zoned along tribal lines.
I think he felt that if the people were divided up ethnically on a tribal basis, it would not be so easy for them to combine and present a united front against the authorities. In other words, this is an application of the age-old principle, divide and rule.
But Africans were being united by the tightening of the pass laws, long used to keep unwanted men out of the towns. Now men lined up in state pass offices for the temporary right to stay. Police arrested more than 1,000 pass offenders every day.
Dr. Vervoerd said the black man was analogous to the ox on the farmer's field. And as long as he was there to serve the purpose of the farmer, well and good. But when that need had been passed, then he had to go.
The pass book was the symbol par excellence of your slave status in this country. Without it, you couldn't work, you couldn't go to school, you couldn't do a damn thing, you couldn't acquire accommodation. It became the kind of symbol that unified black people throughout the country in their determined fight to end apartheid and all that it stood for.
With the past laws tightened up by the government, it was terrible for the Africans. It was the main thing that got us into jails, and it recorded everything that the government had against you.
You needed permission to visit another town, and you couldn't sit there for more than 72 hours without the legal permit to be there. This is what we resented, because it dehumanized us as human beings. But even worse, it continued to remind us that we are black.
The ANC repeatedly protested against the pass laws. Nelson Mandela set up the first black law firm. They did all they could to frustrate the authorities.
They used to appear in court on behalf of offenders, petty offenders of the pass laws, and they were always trying to get around the regulations. It was not only pass laws, but it was the location regulations in the townships. And he was a confounded nuisance as far as I was concerned.
He practiced law at the time when he was known as a Kefa lawyer. And every time he walked into court, the magistrates were absolutely hostile. And he enjoyed seeing this hostility in them and flooring them.
In 1955, the government announced it was extending the pass laws to women. Drought and famine in the countryside were driving increasing numbers of women off the land in search of work. The government wanted them as tightly controlled as the men. ANC women united with Indians and white radicals. In 1956, they called a mass protest.
It was a wonderful sight, striding out, so determined. We presented our protest at the Prime Minister's office. It was taken by 8 leaders, literally staggering, and these enormous piles of Roneoed letters. Each one had the name and address of the woman who had sent it. The door was opened by a very frightened-looking secretary. We said, we want to see the Prime Minister. And he said, the Prime Minister is not here. And we dumped those protests all over the office. And then we withdrew, and we went back to the 20,000 women who were all sitting in the amphitheater waiting very patiently. Lillian couldn't make a speech. That was our leader. She just said the Prime Minister was not there. He has run away from the women. And you could literally feel the anger of the women that we have been treated like this.
In the late 1950s, the women grew more militant. In several areas, they burned the new passes in front of government offices. The authorities were taken by surprise at the vigor of the women's protest. These demonstrations set the stage for South Africa's biggest political show trial. By 1955, despite growing resistance to apartheid, the government had skillfully silenced many of its leading opponents. But the African National Congress and its white and Indian allies hit back. They called a national convention, which was to lead to a public humiliation for the state.
Thousands turned up from all over South Africa in spite of police attempts to stop them arriving. Special trains were organized, but they were prevented from getting there. But nevertheless, thousands and thousands came. It looked just like Derby Day. It was a marvelous weekend.
Africans, coloreds, and Indians met to spell out their grievances and the reforms they wanted to see. They adopted a freedom charter. White minority rule, it declared, had robbed the majority of the land. They demanded that all South Africans be given equal rights.
It was the biggest political gathering that I had attended up to that time, and I don't think that any gathering of that size, political, had been held in the history of South Africa. And what was striking was that it involved people of all the languages of South Africa, all the tribes, all the races.
At the end of the two-day conference, the police searched every delegate and confiscated all their documents. They wanted evidence against Congress leaders for the trial that they believed would finally terminate their activities.
The adoption of the Freedom Charter was absolute anathema. Who are these people to prescribe what sort of state we are going to have in the future? And they were convinced that they would get a conviction of treason of anyone or of everyone who had anything to do with the Congress of the People or the adoption of the Freedom Charter.
In December 1956, the police arrested 156 Congress leaders. They were charged with treason. The opening of the trial was mobbed by supporters of the accused.
All we could hear was the 100,000 voices singing in unison, demonstrating their solidarity with us. Of course, we were separated from our white colleagues who were put in a different section altogether. So it was a coming together of people from throughout the country to you could say, a mass conference at the Johannesburg fort.
I was quite satisfied that I had not committed any act of treason, and no person whom I knew and with whom I had been doing anything. In fact, the policy had always been opposition by non-violent means. And the slogan of non-violence was accepted by all of us, and none of us thought of anything except civil disobedience if it came to the crimes.
For 5 years, the trial tied down ANC leaders like Mandela. For the government, it ended in humiliation. Prosecutors failed to get a single conviction against any of the 156 defendants.
I think this treason trial was the last major attempt to deal with the political opposition by the due process of law.
In 1958, ANC leaders split over the issue of the ANC's alliance with white radicals.
Well, I think the policy of the Congress movement as a whole was multiracialism. And that meant equal recognition of all racial groups. And the ANC implemented that in its political practice. So there is a foundation in the policy. And by the way, the Freedom Charter says that South Africa should belong to all, irrespective of color, and that all racial groups should be equal.
The rival group maintained that Africans must have no white allies. They alone must recover all their land and run it.
The Freedom Charter really meant those who own about 87% of our land will retain ownership of that, you see? And only perhaps out of the kindness of their heart concede 1 acre there and another there to us. Now we couldn't go for that sort of thing.
This minority argued that multiracialism would hinder their recovery of the land. Inspired by the independence movements of Black Africa, they preached Africa for the Africans. Their leader, Robert Sobukwe, told them, "In the new Africa, there will be no special privileges for any class of people. Here in Africa, we are the majority. We should rule."
You know, the appeal he made to me was an appeal that for the first time I saw myself as a human being with human dignity. But whose human dignity, before his speech, was not something that I was conscious of, you see. He aroused a sense of, revolt in my mind.
In 1959, Sobukwe and others quit the ANC to form the PAC, the Pan-Africanist Congress. At the same time, the opposition to apartheid laws grew. A rash of protests broke out all over South Africa. Whole townships boycotted public transport and walked to work rather than pay increased bus fares. Then in Cato Manor, a sprawling slum outside Durban, poverty and police harassment produced an explosion of anger. Women protested when police repeatedly raided their homebrewed beer stores. The men were spending their money in beer halls run by the city council. The profits were used to cover the cost of administering the pass laws.
Women were complaining that men were coming home on Fridays empty-handed, having drank up all the money at those beer halls. And since they were drinking every day and borrowing money from people here and there, and then on Friday, on payday, they pay out the money they borrowed. They felt that these beer halls must go. And they opened the valves. Beer was rolling out into the street, and women climbed and went into the tanks, showing that this beer is not fit for human consumption, and women are bathing in this beer.
When the police arrived to break up the demonstration, the protest turned into a riot. Government offices and buses in Cato Manor were destroyed. By the end of the year, violent protests of government controls had spread across the whole of Natal province. The violence worried the ANC.
Well, the ANC, committed as it was to peaceful and non-violent methods of struggle, issued over 100,000 leaflets appealing to the people to actually stop the violence and use peaceful methods of struggle.
While the ANC tried to calm the women in Natal, the newly formed PAC decided that the time was ripe for a defiance campaign of its own. Its target, the hated pass laws. PAC leaders believed that they could galvanize Africans into a popular uprising. Passes on a special day, they said, were to be left at home.
It was by way of creating chaos, a chaotic situation whereby the authorities would not be able to handle the effects of the campaign. They could not imprison the whole population, for instance, if it snowballed to that extent. They did not have room even if they wanted to, you see, and so on. And in any case, it was aimed at divesting the African people of fear of imprisonment.
The 21st of March, 1960, was the PAC's chosen day. The response to their call was patchy. But at Sharpeville, a new township south of Johannesburg, anger at recent removals brought a crowd of 5,000 to watch the protest.
They were ready because they hated this bus system. They thought there was going to be a relief. I think during those days when you talk of getting rid of a bus, you would get cooperation because they knew the sufferings of the buses.
So they responded, most of them.
The police in Sharpeville refused to arrest PAC members. After 3 hours, the crowd pressed forward. The police panicked and fired.
As I was standing on the bike, the next thing I found myself lying down. I didn't realize at the moment that I was shot. The bullet came here, this flesh was down, came up this way. There were 15 stitches here.
250 were shot. 69 lay dead. Among them, 8 women and 10 children.
I saw others whose flesh was also hanging. We walked slowly towards the main street. Ambulances were bringing many people, and we saw some were crying. I even heard one saying, "Oh, so-and-so is dead." Then I realized this was terrible.
As Africans burned their passes in nationwide protests, the government was forced temporarily to suspend all pass arrests. Strikes and walkouts forced whites to do jobs normally done by blacks. Worldwide criticism was focused on South Africa. Capital flowed out of the country. Vervoerd, who had recently become prime minister, tried to calm the fears of both whites and foreign investors.
We shall not be killed. We shall become nobody's corpse. We shall fight for our existence, and we shall survive.
Cape Town is tense. So is the whole Union of South Africa. Where it is calm outwardly, the news is all of race hatred. Everyone feels that the next day, even the next hour, may see parliamentary government swept aside.
9 days after Sharpeville, for the first time in South Africa's history, black anger struck close to the white parliament itself. "30,000 Africans marched into Cape Town to demand the release of PAC leaders. The march was led by a 19-year-old student, Philip Khosana.
Khosana came to address us. He told us that we should be non-violent as we have promised before, and that we should march peacefully down to Parliament. When we arrived in Parliament, we find that the Parliament was blocked by the soldiers. So we turned back and we went now to Caledon Square to demand the release of our leaders.
The police chief confronted the crowd outside the police station. Khosana demanded to see the Minister of Justice.
I said to Khosana, I said, this is not the way you ask for an interview with the minister. I suggest that you take the whole crowd back to their residences and depute 3 or at the most 4 of your men to come back at 5 o'clock. I'll convey your message to the minister. Then I'll tell you what the minister says and what his attitude is.
Unknown to Khosana, the minister had already spoken to the police chief and ordered him to use force to disperse the crowd.
If I were compelled to use force, I would have thought that Cape Town would have gone up in flames. It would have been a terrible business to use force, because I know the black man, I know his language, and I know his culture. And I know when he sees blood, he goes virtually mad.
Khosana took the police chief's word that he would persuade the minister to meet a delegation. The police chief gave him a bullhorn to repeat the undertaking. The gamble worked. With a police escort at their head, the demonstrators left Cape Town and marched back to their townships.
We didn't know that a government man could fail to keep the promise.
Why didn't the meeting take place?
That I don't know. Minister didn't agree.
Were you disappointed?
I was obviously disappointed, yes. I was very disappointed. Because my word of honor had failed.
When Khazana returned, expecting to meet the minister, he was arrested and imprisoned. The government imposed a nationwide state of emergency. The army scoured the townships. Police arrested thousands of political activists and leaders. Within a week, the government outlawed both the ANC and the PAC. As Sharpeville residents buried their dead, many began to question the black nationalist movement's 50-year commitment to nonviolence.
The whole movement re-examined our past, which was a past of non-violence and pacifism. It had become clear by the end of the 50s that the potential for bringing about change through the old methods had exhausted itself. The people were no longer really prepared to continue responding to calls which led to brutal responses from the enemy without retaliation by the people.
Sharpeville launched a new phase in the relation between the government and its opponents. White fears of an African backlash grew. Housewives spent hours on weapons training. Defiantly, Vervoerd declared South Africa a republic and ended his country's Commonwealth links with Britain.
We are at the beginning of a new era, the era of the Republic of South Africa. The onslaughts which may be made against us will not be made against our form of government. If ever it does come, it will be an onslaught on the existence of our nation and our way of life as we know it. And that we must protect with all that is in our power.
The creation of a republic, cutting the link with Britain, shocked black leaders. They called for a strike. Despite army action in the townships, the stay-at-home was South Africa's biggest protest yet. Now in hiding, ANC leader Nelson Mandela spoke to journalists.
There are many people who feel that the reaction of the government to our stay-at-home, ordering a general mobilization, arming the white community, arresting 10,000s of Africans, the show of force throughout the country. Notwithstanding our clear declaration that this campaign is being run on peaceful and non-violent lines, close the chapter as far as our methods of political struggle are concerned.
Mandela went abroad in 1961 because, apart from gangsters, the blacks had never used a weapon in their life. The only way in which we could pursue this side of the struggle was to find a way of getting material and training militants. Mandela went out to see the newly independent states for the purpose of getting their assistance and the possibility of supplying the kind of weaponry which was needed.
Now, you would have thought having the opportunity to leave the country, he'll stay out. No, he didn't. He came back. And of course, the whole police force in South Africa was looking for him for months. And that's when he earned the name of the Scarlet Pimpernel. And he seemed to absolutely enjoy his escapades.
On December the 16th, 1961, explosions shook South Africa. What Mandela had been doing was organizing Umkhonto Wisizwe, the spear of the nation. With help from the Communist Party, its attacks were carefully designed to avoid taking life. His fellow commander of this sabotage group was Joe Slovo.
I don't think we actually had the illusion that by the kind of actions in which we were engaged, we would bring them immediately to the negotiating table. I think it was a sort of shot for the future in the hope that they would see sense, and they didn't.
At the same time, those PAC leaders still at large were more responsive to demands for a general rising. The townships in the Cape hid an arsenal of homemade weapons.
The people would come to us carrying their pangas, some of them carrying revolvers. They would demand to us that, look, here are weapons, because our argument was that you cannot challenge an armed man unless you yourself are armed.
They would even point to a distant suburb, a distant suburb of Port Elizabeth, where white people, rich white people lived. We want to go there and cut their throats.
Boko, an offshoot of the PAC, launched a series of mob attacks. In one of them, 5 whites were brutally murdered. The government responded with sweeping new security laws. A new sabotage act was designed to muzzle radical opposition. Press censorship, house arrest, and bannings silenced all but a few. When white liberals protested, government supporters attacked their meetings. In 1963, long-term detention without trial was introduced. Suspects began to be locked away without any right of appeal to the courts.
By its very terms, the 90-day or the 180-day or the indefinite detention laws compelled a person who was detained and was later accused of a crime to speak, and that he was told that he would not be released from solitary confinement, or as the police call it, social isolation, until such time as he made a statement to the satisfaction of the Commissioner of Police, which in practice meant to his interrogator.
Detention without trial, isolation in police cells, physical and psychological torture. Practices which, in my experience, in the 50s and the 40s, were never engaged in by the security services. This was something new, and it became very difficult for a person who was dealt with in this way to resist collapsing under this kind of barrage of torture.
By 1963, Boko had effectively been crushed, and the police arrested the commanders of the ANC sabotage campaign. The 10 accused admitted sabotage and faced the death penalty. Mandela was their main spokesman.
He and his courtiers decided that they would nevertheless not pull any punches, that they would say what they had to say in a loud and clear voice. And what it really amounted to was, you made us do it. We had no alternative.
The main black political movements were now crushed. Mandela and all but one of the accused were found guilty of treason. Massive international campaigns pleaded for clemency. The court withheld the death sentence. ANC leaders who had not been imprisoned went into exile to try to maintain their struggle from abroad. Vervoerd had fulfilled the Afrikaner dream. Many whites had doubted the wisdom of apartheid when the government came to power in 1948. Now they looked forward to a future where everyone in South Africa would continue to know his place.
Our special Frontline series on South Africa will continue with 3 more broadcasts. Here is a preview of episodes to come.
Next, on Part 3 of Apartheid, the white Afrikaner government tries to strengthen its hold on the country by forcing urban blacks out of their homes, back to impoverished tribal homelands. This new injustice intensifies black resistance, creating a new leader, Stephen Biko, and unleashing a student movement called Black Consciousness.
Which is going to free the black man from the shackles of white imperialism, white slavery, white oppression. Power!
And finally, student rage boils over in the bloody Soweto riots. In Part 4 of Apartheid, Prime Minister P.W. Botha decides in the late 70s that apartheid must adapt or die. But his moderate reforms please no one, angering many white Afrikaners.
We were sold out. We've got nothing in this country left. Then fight for it. That's right.
And as the world condemns apartheid, union strikes and student rebellions unite blacks throughout the country. Finally, Botha declares a state of emergency. The army occupies the black townships, and a curtain of press censorship descends around South Africa. Part 5 of Apartheid takes us inside forbidden talks in the heart of Africa.
I practiced apartheid, I lived apartheid, and I enjoyed apartheid.
A band of white Afrikaners leave South Africa for an unprecedented confrontation with exiled black rebels.
We are here in the process of building a new nation, a nation of South Africans.
What does this meeting of old enemies tell us about the future?
You can't reform apartheid. You've got to scrap it.
History in the making on the final segment of Apartheid.
We hope you will continue this journey through apartheid. I'm Judy Woodruff. Good night.
For a transcript of this program, please write to Frontline, Box 322, Boston, Massachusetts, 02134. Frontline is produced for the Documentary Consortium by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content. Funding for this special Frontline series was provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.